Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm your host, Park Howell, and I am so proud to welcome Sendable as our sponsor. Sendable is the social media management platform that I personally prefer to handle all of our storytelling online. Sendable has generously offered you, an ardent Business of Story listener, an incredible 30% discount on their traction plan. It's normally $99 a month, but if you use my link, you can get it for just $69 a month. So visit sendable.com/park30 to start your free 30-day trial today.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture, I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands, people buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Last week on the Business of Story, we explored the contrast between simple versus complex narratives and which is more powerful depending on the subject of the conversation. Today, we're going to continue that exploration into the contrast of storytelling styles, tackling rhetoric versus narrative, spin versus storytelling. When to use any of these four approaches to communication and which is more powerful. With us today is Dr. James McCabe, born in Dublin, Ireland, and educated at Oxford, where he earned his PhD in philosophy and where he was awarded the Millennium Prize by the British Council. A poet and scholar by training, James has devoted the last 2 decades to pioneering classical story design in corporate projects. A well-known speaker and consultant in the field, he has worked across the economy from leading technology and industry brands to financial services, automotive, life science, and media. By transferring the techniques of narrative artists from literature, theater, cinema, and television to the business of change and growth, he dramatically improves audience uptake on content and audience engagement at events. Story is a Greek word in origin, literally meaning learning by inquiry, is the opposite of rhetoric, which has dominated commercial life until recently. He believes persuasion is impossible in a world without captive audiences, and we all compete in a world of communication freedom with our audiences constantly distracted, so we strive for emotional involvement in our brand narratives. But the big question is the only way to capture consumer emotional involvement is to toss rhetoric and spin and lead with a story, which presumably releases the timeless sequencing of empathy, suspense, and surprise that only story provides? Well, let's find out right now with Dr. James McCabe on the Business of Story. James, welcome to the Business of Story.
Thank you, Park.
You know, you and I chatted, 2-3 years ago, and we
Almost 3
actually
years ago,
even
yeah.
had an ill-fated recording attempt back in the day with you and one of your
That's true.
colleagues.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we were in 3 different locations, and
Oh,
Wi-Fi
no,
and the interwebs were not helping and cooperating in that one. So it's great to have you back.
Well, thank you.
I
At
think
least we got the technology today going. I think.
your note last week that came in, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. I love that. So I'm ready to do the show. So I've been tracking you for a number of years, and it's just really great to have you here, James.
It's the pictures that got small, Park.
So today we are going to explore the world, which we have not yet done in about 230 episodes, of business storytelling, corporate storytelling, the fallacy of it in a lot of minds when people think they're telling stories and they really aren't. And it's kind of caught in this weird limbo world of the difference between rhetoric versus narrative or spin versus true storytelling. And you come at it from a very classical education in the work you do with your clients and your corporations. Can you give us all a little bit of a backstory on how you found yourself here?
Well, personally, my background is literary. I was a bookworm by nature, and Ireland, especially 30 years ago, was a very literary culture. It still is, but it's a little bit more hip and pop now. And in the past, it was very heavily focused on modernism and classic literature like James Joyce and Samuel Beckett. So I wrote creatively, and I studied, and I went through college, and I went all the way up to doctorate level in Oxford University, studying literature essentially in all its forms. And then,
what did you want to do with that education?
That's a good question. I wanted to be Mr. Chips. I've had the wrong life all this time. So,
Mr. Chips. Who's Mr. Chips?
Goodbye, Mr. Chips was the film that beat Gone with the Wind in 1939 for the best Oscar, best film. So it's basically it's just a kind of a kind-hearted teaching type of guy. But I suppose I still am teacher in a broad sense in the corporate sphere. So I get great pleasure from sharing knowledge and exploring knowledge, and that's really what I do for a living. Yeah.
What were some of your favorite books growing up as a kid?
Well, my all-time favorite book is Finnegan's Wake, which is unreadable, but not unlistenable.
I mean, you actually got through it?
Not only that, but I taught Finnegan's Wake for my sins, and it's an amazing book. And here's a little-known fact to the connection between Finnegan's Wake and Star Wars. Finnegan's Wake was the book that Joseph Campbell immersed himself in, and it's basically the whole hero's journey comes from Finnegan's Wake. In fact, the official name for the hero's journey, what Campbell calls the monomyth, is a neologism that Joyce created. So Joseph Campbell's first book is called A Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake. It was published in the early 1940s. This is about 8 years before The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So basically, that whole system of mythographical comparison really emanates from Finnegan's Wake is kind of like a vade mecum of basically all the stories in the world.
I was going to say, how would you describe Finnegan's Wake?
Crikey. Well, first of all, it's more like a musical composition than a literary one as such. Joyce was really like a failed musician, essentially, or a partly successful singer, but he was very musically minded. So it's also a very Celtic work, and it's cyclical rather than linear, so it doesn't have a linear plot line. People today talk about the end of linear storytelling. Well, Finnegan's Wake was way ahead of its time in that regard. And it's really composed of one giant circle or cycle composed within of 16 smaller circles or wheels. So it's really like a massive contraption. And it's really, Finnegan's Wake is a story of death and rebirth, as indeed all stories are stories of death and rebirth. And Finnegan's Wake kind of sums up all the world's myths and stories through the funnel of one crazy family in the Mullingar Arms pub in Chapel Lizard in Dublin.
But if you take it at face value, when you open it up and flip through the pages, it's nonsensical. You look at it and he makes up words. He has sentences that you have to sit and really think about. I don't know any other better way to explain that. I mean, it takes a ton of work to get through it.
Yeah, I suppose you don't have to get through it. I suppose any small segment will suffice. It's much better listened to than read, because reading does tend to jam up the eyes. It's really meant to be very playful. Somebody accused James Joyce of being trivial, or parts of Finnegan's Wake are just trivial, and he said yes, but some of the other parts are quadrivial. So it's just a very playful. It's a very playful book. I mean, it's comic in the sense that it's not meant to elicit emotion. Yeah. You know, the way there's two essential story genres. People talk about genre in all the different ways, especially in Hollywood. But there are only two story genres originally. One is comic and one is epic. And epic is what business story is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the tale of a tribe. It's supposed to be tribal mojo, cohering and team building. The comic stance is detached and is not so emotional, and it's really, comedy comes into its own. It doesn't really have anything to do with humor or laughter per se. It has to do with that slightly critical detachment and kind of a lampooning or satirizing of everything. That's really what Finnegan's Wake is.
Yeah. And so with your interest as a kid, reading literature and studying literature and getting your PhD in philosophy from Oxford, what brought you into the corporate realm?
I was blown into it purely by accident. Like, all of the great stories. I found myself alone in the wood in middle age, like Dante's Divine Comedy. So it was just a complete accident that I found myself teaching originally managers from the German company Siemens in the 90s English, and slowly became involved in what they were trying to do rather than just communicate, but actually becoming aware of the challenges that they faced in business, and what are people trying to do when they're using language. They're trying to enact or get things done.
So you essentially were an English teacher for Siemens leadership so that they could have greater international impact, and in doing so, then uncovered the narratives and the stories that were happening, and you probably heard or did not hear stories and thought to yourself, what in the hell are you guys doing? What good is it for me to train you how to speak English if you don't actually know how to use it in a narrative style that actually...
Exactly. Very good. Plus the fact that this was, let's say 20, 25 years ago, when a lot of European, Western brands were starting to experience heavy Asian competition, and products are starting to be equally excellent and equally cheap everywhere. So things like the narrative start to become much more significant. You don't need marketing when you have the world's best product and nobody else has. But when everybody has the world's best product, you need much more than marketing. You need great drama in order to grab the attention of people and sustain it.
So is this where you first started saying rhetoric was their commonplace of a form of communication, and you realized they needed to bring more narrative or storytelling into it?
Yeah, it sounds as if I come down hard on rhetoric. I've got nothing against rhetoric, and rhetoric has its place. Rhetoric is simply, it's the art of public discourse, and people generally speak in public when they want something to happen or when they want other people to do anything. So my definition of rhetoric, rhetor is the Latin word for a public speaker. So a rhetor or a public speaker, anybody that speaks in public, is trying to persuade somebody of something. And that's what basically everybody in business is doing. They don't have to be involved in sales or marketing. Anybody in business is trying to persuade somebody else to do something or not to do something. So persuasion is the core feature or quality of rhetoric. And it's fine. It's just that today we're all interrupted so much. We never get to be persuaded by anybody because we don't have any time to give anybody. Even if you give a public speech nowadays, you're talking to a crowd that are staring at some other screen, and you'd be lucky if that was just one other screen instead of multiple other screens at the same time. So we have left behind an era of undivided attention, and it is practically impossible to get anybody's undivided attention today. So it's not an age of information. We're in the middle of the age of interruption.
And so rhetoric, where I'm out there just messaging you with the interest of persuading you to see my way of things or to get you to buy into something or whatever, you feel replace that with narrative or story. And how would you define those differences?
The essential distinction that I draw between these two languages, I see them as languages. I see rhetoric as a language of persuasion, and I see drama as a language of involvement. And the essential difference is rhetoric or persuasion is teaching by example. So basically, that's the old way that businesses did things, that they marketed and sold. They taught the world. It's what Steve Jobs said, make a dent in the universe. So in other words, you can still do that, I think, if you're a manufacturer. Look at this wonder product, wonder drug, just do this. So you kind of teach by example, eat your own dog food, etc. But drama, rather, or storytelling, is learning by inquiry. In fact, that's the original meaning of the word. The word story is a Greek word in origin, and it literally means learning by inquiry. So it's bearing witness. So you're not teaching, and you're not the expert. You are the empathizer. And I think that, rhetoric leans heavily on the expertise. Expertise is also very obsolescent nowadays with the internet. Knowledge is immediately obsolescent today. So what we're left with simply are the relationships and the experiences that people are having. And empathy is replacing expertise. And drama is the language of empathy.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting when you were describing those two different ones. My dad popped up in my mind.
Yeah.
He was a civil engineer, and he always had just this wonderful wisdom of the Norwegians because he was, I swear, part Viking. He was so much fun. Rhetoric coming from him would be do as I say, not as I do. So don't always follow my example, but here's what I really think you need to do. But in the way he would really impart knowledge through storytelling, he would always start out with, a guy might consider, and then he would take you into an event that was something similar to what you're experiencing, and I guess provide a little fable or a moral within that story.
Exactly.
So much more powerful.
Yeah. Rhetoric is Old Testament, basically. It operates on commandments, whereas storytelling is really New Testament, and it functions as a form of parable, where the metaphor is the operative instrument. Yeah, where you're creating a fable or an analogy. It's funny you mentioned the Vikings. They have their own storytelling expert. Their own Joseph Campbell is a man in the Middle Ages called Snorri Sturluson. He's the Homer of the North, who collected all the myths and the Icelandic sagas. So every culture has their own Joseph Campbell, their own sort of mythographer or story boffin, what I call story boffin. But Snorri Sturluson is the Viking Homer.
Snorri Sturluson.
Snorri Sturluson. Look him up.
I'm going to have to look him up.
He's the man that codified all the sagas in Iceland.
Yeah. And do these sagas follow the same pattern to the hero's journey when you say that their version of Joseph Campbell? Are they similar in that
Well,
form?
I suppose I reckon about half of what's produced, certainly in the United States on the screens for television and film, seems to be, templated out of the hero's journey. But the hero's journey is just one quest motif among many. But all story forms of any kind tend to follow this core ceaseless sequence, which is empathy, suspense, surprise. No matter how you term those, they always seem to follow in that order. Okay, that the empathy representing the going online and getting bonded to a character or a set of characters, the suspense of not knowing what's going to happen next and wanting to know what's going to happen next, and then the surprise, which is in some way, the finale that's inevitable, but also comes as some kind of a shock.
So kind of an act 1, act 2, act 3, empathy is built
very simplistically. This is also, if you look at Arthur Miller's teacher in university, he was a man called Kenneth Rowe. His sequence was attack, complication, resolution. It's exactly the same thing, that you have a character under pressure. In other words, there's some attack in their life. Then there is a complication where everything is suspenseful. And then there is a surprising resolution. And on the hormonal level, because story is a biological involvement, you're not just watching story or listening to it with your brain or your heart. Your whole body's involved because there are hormones being released throughout your whole system. This is not the case with rhetoric. It would be oxytocin, cortisol, and dopamine. Yeah, the empathy drug, the suspense drug, and the surprising release drug. Yeah, the happy ending drug. And you'll have different authors or different storytellers specializing in one form or another. We know that Stephen King is not a dopamine fiend; he is a cortisol maniac. Yeah, and we know that Disney tends to prefer double chocolate chip dopamine. Yeah. And we know that all organizations of all kinds, public and private, have an enormous oxytocin deficit. Simply said, nobody cares about them. And that's the thing that they have to start with, including religious bodies and political parties and governments.
Yeah. Now, when you boil it down to that level, the hormonal level, it makes me come back, and I'm no evolutionary biologist, but I look at that and think, we have oxytocin, cortisol, and dopamine for very important reasons in our body, and I think they can all boil down to the pure survival mechanism. So oxytocin, how can I connect with my tribe and be a part of the social group because I'm much safer within a group than on my own?
Yes.
Cortisol, kind of that fight or flight drug, am I going to take on the saber-toothed tiger or am I going to get the hell out of here? And then dopamine, that reward drug of, my God, I made it safely back to my cave so I can share this story, this event with everybody there in order to trigger their oxytocin, their cortisol, and their dopamine so that the tribe can remain safe. So do you think you can boil it down to that? I mean,
without question, it's if you think about storytelling, people think of stories as connected with words, for example, or language, but it predates language and words by many millennia. A story also predates numbers, and people in business tend to think numerically. They think that numeracy is somehow superior to literacy, but story predates both, and story is the original idiom. It's the human idiom. It's the thing. Language or tools do not define Homo sapiens, because some animals use tools and many animals use languages, but no animals use stories. And stories is the human idiom. It's as simple as that. And it has absolutely to do with survival, with creative problem solving.
I had a aha moment a couple months back, and I want you to think about this, James. What is the first syllable in number?
Syllable. Numb.
Exactly. Our brains are numb to the numbers. And, one of the first places I heard this was kind of an aha moment way back when with our fellow friend, Robert McCabe. And I was in his story course over in LAX Sheridan, and then I got a chance to go out to his home in Connecticut and do my very, very, very first podcast with him. I spent about 3 hours recording with him, and it's on SoundCloud, has nothing to do with this, but it was the first realization I got how powerful narrative was. And when he would say over and over again is that data that we keep spewing out as executives and the numbers we keep throwing out are just bouncing off our limbic system because they are absolutely nonsense to us. They're meaningless unless placed in the context of an event through a story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the example I always give is the Iliad. Why does the Iliad still exist? It's over 2,500 years old. It is an eternal story. And the fascinating thing about Homer's Iliad is that there were many other epics about the Trojan War, but they do not survive. So what is it about Homer's Iliad that made it survive? And there's a number of fascinating design principles built into the Iliad. The first one is that it's all concentrated through one person. Okay, although there's tens of thousands of soldiers involved and civilians involved, it's all funneled through one person's feelings. Achilles, okay, who's feeling miffed because Agamemnon has stolen his war booty, Briseis. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it simply what you get is the emotional quality or the emotional temperature of one human individual. So selection is the first principle of gaining somebody's attention and focus. And that's what you don't get with numbers, because numbers are just damned lies and statistics. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Also, the Iliad takes place during a period of 200 days. During a 10-year period. So we have the art of selectivity there again. The Trojan War takes place over 10 years. The Iliad does not even discuss the Trojan horse. So it just focuses one short period of a month or 2 months towards the climax. It doesn't picture the beginning. It doesn't picture the end. It just focuses on rising action near the climax. So the setting and the timing of the Iliad is immense. And there's one other trick that Homer uses, which is incredible, and it's very rare. You know the end of the story before you start. And so everything, of course, in the Greek epic world is preordained. And Homer removes the element of choice, which is fascinating because that's what most stories are all about. And this master craftsman, who was also a teacher of story as well as being a poet from the island of Kos in the Aegean, removes the element of choice. So he wants to make the audience really understand and feel the quality of that. It's kind of a concentration on choicefulness because it's absent. So Achilles is bound to die if he enacts his heroic destiny. He chooses an early death and to be a hero in eternal memory. So there are a number of design principles that have nothing to do with, telling the Trojan War as a data set, for example.
Telling the Trojan War of a data set. I like that.
Yeah. Exactly.
So what can modern day corporate storytellers learn from this? And I think you and I share the same frustration that so many people out there are saying, "Oh, we tell stories all the time," and then you sit down and you're a part of their conference, and no stories show up anywhere.
Well, your patience must be strained again and again by this park, yeah?
No, it's called market opportunity.
Yeah, I'm a storyteller too. It's just what every dog in the street says. Well, maybe they are if they actually just knew what it was.
Yeah.
What I'm coming across today a lot are data analytics people, actually. So it's not the communicators and not the strategists or the marketers, but the geeks who have got all this investment and are now running the shop because every company is now data driven, but they're not able to narrate their insights in a connected way or to gain people's attention. So they're really craving this ability to create story in a meaningful way and to think episodically. They can create dashboards and they can create spontaneous reports on anything, but they can't connect things together and they can't create progression or succession, which is meaningful or emotive.
Do they really understand that they've got to be able to do this, or are they flailing about saying, my data makes no sense to everyone, help me, and you have to go in and introduce them to this episodic thinking and story?
I think it's a fascinating question. I think there's a disconnect that people go home at night and they watch television or they watch screens of some kind. And when it bores them, which it usually does within seconds, they zap channels. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't bring that same awareness to their business day. And they create slide decks and reports and dashboards for other people that bore them in seconds. And so, business needs to be at least as well communicated as television, in the sense of holding the interest of people and earning the attention of people. And I think a lot of business people genuinely feel frustrated. They do know that it's very important, but they don't know where to start. And essentially their whole education leads them to trust in rhetoric and keep ramming home better data sets, rather than actually being confident enough to select certain elements of data and to sequence them in a progressive way, in a kind of dramatic way, and to release them to an audience in a way that capitalizes on suspense and surprise. They simply, I think it's a lack of self confidence, actually.
Well, and I think knowledge moving from an intuitive storyteller, which humans are, into an intentional one, and being able to use that same analytical thinking, but use the algorithm of story structure and elements to be able to do that. Do you feel like data in and of itself conspires to make an executive speak in rhetoric versus story, that it just is in that logical brain of theirs, and so they're going to come off as saying, well, look, at the data doesn't lie. Here's the example of it, so just do what the data says.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very strong paradigm today, and it's sort of this science doesn't lie motif, which is just total BS, yeah, because who's collecting the data and what are their parameters, and there's nothing objective about anything. And also, I think in business there's a sense that stories are kind of fictive, and that business is non-fiction, and people have a feeling that that non-fiction is somehow more believable or something than story. I mean, non-fiction and fiction are just different forms of storytelling. The same principles apply. I think rapidly, very rapidly, we're heading towards what I call an attention economy, where the only form of attention worth grabbing is basically story form or story driven. And story is the currency of an attention economy. Yeah.
You use story to hack through the noise and hook the hearts of your audiences.
Yeah, without question. I mean, the thing is to do this in an endlessly fresh way. I mean, there is a kind of a rhythm or a code which is always the same. Like if you don't bond with a character, even if that character is an inanimate object, you're not going to pay attention over the course of an episode or over a complete story. So there's a certain, character conflict crisis. That kind of sequence always remains the same, but you have to continually renew and refresh it.
Can you give us an example, James, of where you've seen, and maybe it's through your work you've done with someone, where they had these big data sets, they were doing a poor job of communicating it, and story came to help them out? They used story to be able to put in the context and have it create meaning for their audiences?
Well, yeah. Nowadays, I find myself working a lot with what do you call these people? Startups. These people that are, the people that are building startups, people that are developing products, and people that are analyzing data. These seem to be the three real drivers now for the people that understand the value of story. We're seeing a lot this year in 2019. We're seeing a lot of tech IPOs that are flopping and stuff and sagging. That if they don't flop, they sag. So they launch on Wall Street, but just the share price just sags because they don't have a great story. So we're seeing a lot of situations where story is absolutely required. And I think the initial public offering is the best single test of a story, of how good a story is, particularly as the kind of glitter, the honeymoon period for technology is now over. I think 2019, with the Congress hearing that we just saw on the screens about 2 weeks ago, we'd say that the honeymoon phase for the geeks is over. Yeah. And that they better get serious about their narratives now.
So who's done a good job lately in the startup realm that you can point to?
I mean, I can't think of any particular one offhand. I mean, I know. I'm working with some startups. To be quite honest, I feel that most of them just feel that their wonder product is going to do it all. That they don't really need a good story, or if they are developing stories, they're incredibly samey. Differentiation is crucial in marketing, and in storytelling, you have to, as Ezra Pound said, you have to make it new. This is why we call the novel, because it means new. You didn't hear this before, or if it's the same theme, it's delivered in a completely different way. So, obviously the way Apple did the personal computer and the way it reinvented itself in the late 90s was the single greatest business narrative of all time, in my opinion. And I'm not a fan of Apple as a brand necessarily. I don't buy Apple products at all, but just studying that turnaround in the late 90s.
And you're talking about the Think Different narrative and how they pulled that together.
Think Different is a very rare example. It's a company that has 6 months to live, 6 months to bankruptcy, no product, no iPhone, no iPod, no iMac, nothing. They have jobs that comes back, and then he gives this campaign to an agency. He doesn't really trust the story, but it's a great story. It's inspired by Dead Poets Society, the Carpe Diem speech, and they come up with a Think Different campaign. It says nothing about computers. It says nothing about Apple. It celebrates people like Mahatma Gandhi and John Lennon, and their estates allow Apple to use their images, often for the first time. And it was a massive success. Within 12 months after this, the share price has recovered by 300%, and there's no new product. Nothing else has changed. It's a very, very rare example of massive financial proof of great story. Yeah.
Now, was that a story, though? Because were they really telling a story, or were they, it sounds to me like it's more rhetoric in that, they want you to think different, lead by example versus taking you through a story.
I get you, Park. I mean, maybe it's not a pure story. I agree that it was quite, message driven from that point of view. However, what they were doing was they were evoking, in a poetic way, they were evoking the strength of people like Mahatma Gandhi or John Lennon to go against the grain. And so it was, if you look at visually, with the old footage, and it was kind of, from that point of view, it was kind of poetic. I mean, it didn't really have an argument as such. It wasn't developed in a logical way as to why you should think different. Mm-hmm. It was more like a slogan or a war cry.
Well, I'm trying to celebrate the it was the disruptive iconoclast in yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. I would say that it was, as a campaign, it was more expressive than descriptive. And message-driven argumentation tends to be more like, testimonial points and breaking it out in a mathematical fashion. I think it was more like a kind of a flavor, to be daring to be an outlier, and gave the brand, it was kind of like a great whoosh of wind in the dead sails.
Yeah. I mean, we refer to that all the time. It seems like, it's like, I wish I could find someone else that does it as well, or used to do it as well as Apple. I'm not sure they're on their game ever since Jobs.
No, I agree.
I
agree. Exactly. Yeah. There was a great advertisement a few years back in the middle of the last crash, which was It's Halftime in America, which was scripted by a poet. It was the Chrysler ad narrated by Clint Eastwood.
Yep.
It was a comeback story. That was a wonderful story. I mean, again, it wasn't really a narrative as such, but it was kind of like gutsy and ballsy. And it's a very short little advertisement, a Super Bowl ad. It had an Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. The best, like speech that I can think of in story form is Steve Jobs, the 2005 commencement speech.
Stanford commencement speech.
Exactly, yeah.
He shares those 3 little anecdotes about himself.
It's just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And the story was, I understand that it was he wanted Aaron Sorkin to script this speech, and didn't deliver or whatever. So Jobs turns around at the last minute and writes this himself. It's whether that's apocryphal or not, I don't know. But it is a wonderful speech in very Act 1, Act 2. It's actually 3 stories. Each one has 3 mini acts, and it's got a little lyrical prologue and flourish. It's perfect. It's absolutely a gem. Yeah.
James, I'd like to take a break here so that I can introduce my good friends over at Sendable. And when we come back, I want to talk to you about the difference between spin and storytelling, because you and I went back and forth a little bit on this on email, and I was really fascinated with your approach to it. So let's cover that right after this message from Sendable. Many of you have been following me in the business of story on social media for a while now, and I really appreciate it. And if you're not, I hope you will. We share valuable business storytelling tips to help your brand stand out among the awful noise out there. And we do it all thanks to Sendable, a social media management platform that helps over 3,000 digital agencies worldwide to work with their clients, breathe life into their brands, and get their stories heard on social media. What we like about Sendable is they make it super easy to manage your content and your stories online. They allow you to source content from clients and collaborate closely with them to create a social media strategy built on true and proven storytelling principles. You can reliably plan and schedule content to be automatically published to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and more. And you can demonstrate the impact that this content has had on your audience growth and conversion by reaching out through their in-depth reporting and analytics. There's much, much, much more that you can do. But you know what? I think maybe my favorite feature has to be Smart Posts functionality. Now, what Smart Posts are is it makes it incredibly easy to craft social media content and in one single step, customize it for each platform, giving you the best chance of driving engagement and getting people to pay attention to your content. Sendable truly makes managing so many channels an absolute breeze. I know, you have a lot of choices when it comes to social media management apps, so I wanted to let you know we here at the Business of Story can't recommend Sendable enough. Gavin and his team are so great that they have a special offer just for you. You can now get, as a special offer for Business of Story listeners, Sendable's Traction Plan for only $69 a month. That's a 30% savings. So sign up now at sendable.com/Park30. Believe me, your stories will take off. Welcome back to Business of Story. So great to have with us today Dr. James McCabe, European PhD philosopher, storyteller that has studied the classics and brings his encyclopedic knowledge of the classics to the corporate world. and helping us all do a better job of communicating our story. So, James, we had talked about the difference between spin and storytelling, and you say they are completely different, that if your story, if you are sharing what you believe is a story, is delivering a message of persuasion, that's not really a story. Do I have that right?
Yeah. I mean, I know that's a tough call because essentially as a human being, we're just driven by our own personal needs. And most organizations and brands have one dominating drive, which is to continue to exist in the future. So they're basically like just biological creatures desperate to survive into the future. So they can't stop thinking about their own survival. So this means that their marketing and their communication, their events and their products and their brands are all driven by that. So the need to get the message out there and bang the drum. But I think that we're rapidly moving into an era of, so-called customer centricity, when we are supposed to be, wrapping ourselves around the customer, thinking in terms of their own immersive experience. And the question that I always request of my clients is the following, and this is a tough question to answer. It's kind of impossible, but it stops you thinking about your own brand. So I ask them to think or ask themselves, what customer dilemma does this organization exist to resolve? It's a very difficult question to answer because it may not have anything to do with your brand. What customer dilemma does this organization exist to resolve? Okay, so that's really the beginning of stories, when you stop thinking about your own survival needs and you start thinking about your audience, and their temperature and what's going on for them and how to tune into that.
Well, and the argument could be that every brand is in the problem-solving business. That's just another way, I believe, of saying what you're saying there is, if I'm selling you jeans, yes, you're getting a nice pair of jeans, but what problem am I really solving for you? It could be self-identification. It could be fear of not being accepted. It could be a number of different things. So at the heart of story is conflict and a problem. Correct? I mean, we talked about, if we look back at how we outlined the stories earlier, setup, problem, resolution. So when a brand is telling that story, let's go to Nike and say it's telling one of its stories of one of its athletes, but only for you to connect the dots to say, but you don't have to be a world-class athlete. Just do it. Get out there and do it. They're telling that story, but there's a message to be delivered and there is persuasion in it. So it doesn't make it just rhetoric, correct? I mean, if they're using...
Yeah, exactly. So I would, exactly, Park. I would say that, there are stories in the pure form or purer than others from the point, not moralistically purer, but in terms of the
architecture of the story.
Dramatic makeup, yeah?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then you have other campaigns or advertisements or whatever, which are deeply rhetorical, yeah? And I think that the more dynamic, the more dramatic, and the more narrative messages are in the future, the more effective they will be. I think that Nike, from the little I know of Nike, did a wonderful job of, deciding to really enlarge the scope of what they communicated from their own brand or whatever they did into the whole field of, like daring and performance. So basically, they went beyond the idea of themselves and they tapped into the much bigger emotion or feeling of performance or, agony in the original Greek sense of performing in front of others,
Mm-hmm.
And the daring that requires, the heroism of it, I suppose. So Nike became a heroic brand, and it's even reflected in this Greek name for the company, the concept of victory, Nike being the goddess of victory, yeah? Mm-hmm. So it has a very heroic tribal impact from that point of view. So from that point of view, it was a very sophisticated storyteller from that point of view, yeah.
So how then do you coach your customers to avoid spin? Like if they say, hey, James, I've got a new story I want to share with you, and it feels like spin to you. Number one, how do you identify it as spin? And then what do you tell them to do differently?
Well, I suppose what I try and tell them is that they have to imagine that nobody is listening and that nobody cares and that there is no audience. And I think if they start from that humble basis, they start thinking about how to earn attention, that there's no captive audience, and that they have to earn attention from the first few seconds. And I think that, what I try to do with them is to help them tap into the zeitgeist and help them to speak to something that's far larger than their own specific enterprise.
And do you have an example of that?
In campaigns with well, I suppose that it's like this. It's kind of like a philosophical discussion that the idea behind the brand or the product is the basis. Okay, so let's say the idea behind Apple is independence. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Or let's say it's somehow being unique or something. Okay, you're kind of like some kind of a star or individual when you're choosing Apple, and that's the start. Okay, that you conceptualize your brand or your product as a concept, as an idea. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
an idea is something that's standing on its own, is an intellectual construct. So that's step one. Step two is to translate or transfer that idea into its emotional content. Okay, so independence is not a feeling or an emotion, but there could well be a feeling of exhilaration or zest or just freedom. If I use the word freedom instead of the word independence, I'm moving more towards a more emotional, feeling-based quality. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so most companies, let's take a bank of some kind, they have a portfolio. Okay, and then they want this portfolio to, let's say, communicate or transmit is the word, trust. Okay, the problem with that is that trust is a universal abstract term. It's not actually a feeling. Yeah, it may result or may be the cause of different feelings. But what you have to do is you have to identify or distinguish your own special version of that. Okay,
Of the
and this
feeling
is
of trust, or
yeah, because
of what trust
trust
means
is
to you.
a spectrum. First of all, it's completely different. In that you trust a 4-year-old in a completely different way than you would trust an adult. Trust is culturally completely subjective. So you have to distinguish exactly what type of emotional force you represent. Okay. Once you do that, when you've chosen that, then in order to generate the stories in your campaign and for your events and for your different media and platforms, you have to split the atom of that emotion or quality into its two extremes. Okay? So you tell a story which is polarized between those two extremes, and then the narrative and the drama takes place between that emotion and its absence or its opposite.
So again, can you give us an example of that? Because I think I know what you're talking about, and I would love to see it in action.
This is the mystery of mysteries, Park. You're asking me to explain the universe.
No, a brand that does it well, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Who do you think besides Apple, is there someone else out there that seems to do this, bring these two polarities together in a really powerful, emotional way to build or transmit trust to their customers?
I'd have to say no. I can't really think. I can think of great stories, great plays, or great films that do this well. If I'm thinking of a great brand, I think that some brands have managed to make the leap from what they do and who they are into this wider narrative. Lego is one in Europe. Lego was actually before the Great Depression. Lego was a Danish, I believe, furniture manufacturer. The business dried up in the Great Depression in the 1930s because people weren't buying furniture until they realized that the thing that people never stop buying are toys for their kids. So Lego went from being a furniture manufacturer to being a toy maker based on an accidental discovery during the Great Depression. And then in the last couple of decades, they have basically become a media company making films. So basically, they turn themselves into drama. And the company is cyclical. They have their ups and downs. But I think it's a very good example of a company that has managed to understand that it is first and foremost today not a furniture manufacturer or a toy maker. It's actually a media company. Lego is a company that understands this well, and I think all companies in the future will be media companies that happen to do something else.
Yeah, Red Bull's another good example of that.
Yeah, Red Bull is a very sophisticated brand that understand this very well, that behaves, thinks, and acts like a media concern first and foremost. Yeah.
I mean, I could even look at Patagonia for that matter, and the
Right.
kind of work that they do in documentaries
Yeah.
and following people. They are another form of media company that I think is having a great impact. By the way, when you watch a Lego movie, which I think are absolutely hysterical, I mean, every one of those is the hero's journey. I mean, if you want to just overlay it on the hero's journey, you want to see the hero's journey in action, watch a Lego movie.
Yeah, I mean, I often think about McDonald's, for example, which has been around for a very long time, and there has been a film made recently about the Ray Kroc story or whatever. McDonald's is certainly a company that's facing change in customer habits and behavior, yeah? And they have, I was reading that Ronald McDonald supposedly is the second most recognizable character in the universe after Jesus Christ. I've never seen him speak or in any kind of narrative or cartoon or film or nothing. So they have an incredible character persona that they've done absolutely nothing with. And they need to get more attention. They need, obviously, to evolve. I suppose
I don't want to see McDonald's become a media
I know,
company.
Park, but I'm just saying from a basic narrative point of view. I'm not being pro or anti McDonald's. I'm just saying, it's a narrative challenge. Okay, so I would say that all companies in the world today are trying to tell a growth story, when in fact many of them should really be telling a comeback story. And it takes guts to tell a comeback story, because you have to fess up a bit and you have to share some of your vulnerability. And many companies are no longer growing, but they should actually be evolving. And I think Apple is a great example of an evolution story. Evolution is not faster, better, cheaper. Evolution is faster, better, cheaper, different. Something is different. So growth just involves more. And evolution involves change. And that's when stories really come into play to help companies think outside themselves. And I think this is very difficult for companies to do, even for startups to do, because they actually believe they're in the business of what they do, what they're not. They're in the media business, which has no limits. Platform companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, they don't do any one thing. They do anything they want to. So they're everywhere. They're actually pervasive. And it's no mystery to me that last year, the first two companies globally to be valued at over $1 trillion were Apple and Amazon, two companies that have opened film studios. That's not accidental.
That's interesting.
They're actually in the story business. They know what they're in. They know what business they're in. They're essentially narrative organizations.
Is that because our Homo sapien minds just love to be entertained through story?
It's really because what's happened is the mobile screen has brought cave painting back. We kind of left literature behind. We're in a post-literate age. I'm even realizing people
digital cave painting is what you're talking about.
Digital cave painting, exactly. People don't read anymore. People don't even listen that much, maybe, but they watch the whole time. And the image, it's an age of visualization.
Well, we are visual beings. If you think about all the stimuli that affects us the most is what comes in through our eyes, and then secondly, what we hear to experience. But, on this show and others, or in your storytelling, what are you really doing? You're trying to ignite the theater of the mind of your audience so that it will spring to life and you can project onto their brains these vivid images that they don't soon forget.
Very poetic, Park, to ignite the theater of your mind. I like it. Theater is a Greek word which means the place of seeing. So it is the show, not tell. And it's interesting that the Greeks, when they built a new city, they could have built a temple or they could have built a public square, an agora, but the very first building they ever built with a new city, because it was all by design, was the theater. And they knew that once the theater was built, the rest of the city would be finished, because the theater was the place where the tribe went to get its mojo. Yeah, and so they understood the primacy of story, and the theater was also a place where ideas were presented democratically, and the audience could make up its own mind. So I do see storytelling as very connected to the rise of democracy. And wherever you see tyrannies, you see repression of storytellers.
Well, I mean, just look at Donald Trump. you can argue that his tyrannical reign, what he believes is, he's not a great storyteller, but he just is rhetoric through his little blurbs and his little tweets. And what does he do? He comes out after fake news or anybody that has a true story to tell about what he's up against or what he's doing. So I think that's a really good example of rhetoric versus story.
Yes, definitely. And also on another level, to people that support Donald Trump, I don't have political persuasions one way or the other because it's all rhetoric to me. But to people that support Donald Trump, it is kind of, I believe it must be kind of as if he's a superhero tackling evil Washingtonian antagonists. I don't know what it is, but there's obviously something that he's tapping into. It's a very crude form. It's kind of comic book storytelling where he must be a superhero to somebody.
Yeah, well, they've got a narrative they're certainly living into. And, the thing that's fascinating to me is we all want the same things, do we not? Whether you're far right or far left or believe in Donald Trump or don't believe in Donald Trump, don't we essentially want the same things? We want safety for our families. We want opportunities for ourselves and our kids. We want sanctity of that family in that neighborhood. It's just we go about it in completely different ways depending on which narrative we've bought into.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an American, but I'm a great admirer of America, and I'm deeply
someone still
sad.
out there that is, huh? Awesome.
I'm a great admirer of America, but I'm deeply saddened by the coarsening of relations between the different groupings in the States and the rawness of civil discourse.
Yeah,
and I think it's maybe, the American dream in reverse. It's the first generation that's not automatically going to have it better than the parents. There's a lot of pressure, but I'm a great admirer in the innate, what's the word I'm looking for? Heroism of the American people.
Well, couldn't you even say that Trump got elected on a comeback story? America was once a great and mighty nation, but America is no longer great. Therefore, I'm going to make America great again. Isn't that the same?
This reminds me of the take back control motif, which won the Brexit referendum 3 years ago. And they say, psychologists do say that, the best pitch is a missed opportunity.
What do you mean by that? The best pitch is a missed opportunity.
The best pitch is a missed opportunity. The feeling of loss. This is why salespeople always tell you there's only so many days left and your time is running out, and why the airline tells you that there's only one seat left, so you better buy it now, because human beings are terrified of something that's irredeemably lost, like Paradise Lost.
Scarcity.
Yeah, but I would say that the dangers of Trumpian narrative or Brexit drama both of them are cast backwards into the past in terms of returning to something that maybe never was. And so they risk this retro kind of fiction. Neither of them are as inclusive as they could be or as forward-looking as they could be.
Yeah, juxtapose that so that looking back and I guess maybe even playing off nostalgia a little bit. Now just overlay JFK going to the moon, when he said we are going to put a man on a rocket and put him on the moon, return him safely home within this decade on a 30-story rocket built of metal alloys that do not yet exist, propelled by fuels that we're going to have to invent, guided by navigation systems that are only in our minds at the moment. So talking about living into a fiction, living into something and making it happen for the betterment. And then think of all of the technology and the really positive human impact that came out of that one singular mission of Apollo. It's so different than it seems like the world we're living in today.
Well, it was very poignant, the anniversary or the 50th year this summer, and there was something very wistful about that, wasn't there?
Yes.
Because it was almost like the last inclusive dream that was large, scopeful, and it was a very wistful anniversary last summer.
Yeah. Well, James, fascinating. As we wrap up here, is there any 1, 2, or 3 tips that you could offer our listeners to have them go back and re-examine the narratives they're telling to make them more powerful?
Well, My final advice would be the following, that in the search for better content and more dynamic storytelling for brands and for, enterprises, I would suggest what people do is stop listening to consultants and geeks and to start focusing on screenwriters and showrunners and people that have to create gigantic television series like Game of Thrones, and look at their interviews and study, how they think. Because today in business, you have exactly the same problem. It's like trying to create a television series from scratch, to create a multi-season series that continues to snowball audience each season. It's exactly like trying to run a business today. So you better have great characters, and you better have characters that your audience can identify with. And you better stop thinking and talking about yourself and your brand and your portfolio and your testimonials. And you better start thinking in terms of attention, empathy, suspense, and surprise, and focus on the professionals. The professionals are the artists, the storytellers. And today's iconic storytellers, the showrunner. It's the people that create the Sopranos and Breaking Bad. These are the people that you will learn from when you study in terms of writing a great piece for your new product or service. Yeah,
it's a great point, because aren't we all really running episodic
totally
stories in the growth of our individual businesses?
Exactly. And those people, Park, that is their only intellectual property. And when they fail, they starve to death, literally. It's a tough business if you're in Hollywood and you're an unemployed screenwriter. The vast majority are starving. Okay. Yeah. And they're learning. They're absolutely learning, because that's all they have. So I think that, what they learn is gold dust. And even I just watched a speech there, a lecture. I think it's a BAFTA lecture the other day by Paul Schrader, the screenwriter for Taxi Man. It's absolutely just like a bucket of gold dust, for storytellers of all kinds.
Is that online, or is it something you saw?
It's online. It's on, as far as I know, it's on YouTube. Yeah. Paul Schrader is a kind of grand old screenwriter now. He's been around since the 70s. He's made about 4 films for Martin Scorsese. But
was that Taxi Driver then?
He wrote Taxi Driver. Taxi Driver was a metaphor for his own life, but absolutely the single best, what would you say, a breakdown of the challenge that I've come across, and these things are now just available, just
I'll have to take a look at that.
Paul Schrader, yeah.
Thank you for the heads up. And James, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today,
pleasure.
All the way from Dublin. Really awesome to be speaking with you. I guess actually you're in France today, aren't you? You seem to be
today. I'm in France, but yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It sounds like you're sitting right across from me. So thanks so much. I want to thank all of you for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard here today and would like to share some of James' wisdom with your folks, certainly give them this episode. Send them the link, tune them in to it. Just really some great, amazing storytelling wisdom right here today. And of course, you could help me if you jumped over to iTunes and give me a rating and review on the show. We are trying to build those throughout the remainder of the year here, because it certainly helps open us up to new audiences, and I appreciate that. The other request I have of you is, if you feel like your storytelling is not being heard online, you're having a hard time just in the chaos of hacking through the noise and hooking the hearts of your customers, and even physically having a hard time with it, then by God, jump over to Sendable. Gavin Hammer and his team over there are doing an amazing job with this platform. It's a platform we use here at Business of Story. And as a thank you for listening, they will offer you 30% off their traction plan. Comes in at just $69 per month, and it will do everything you need to have happen to become a powerful storyteller online. So jump over there, go to sendable.com/park30, park30, and you can get that 30% discount on their traction plan. And of course, join me next week when we will have another amazing story artist here, just like Dr. James McCabe. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.